Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. Delighted you could join us on this very cold February evening, so thank you for braving the somewhat inclement conditions to join us. We're delighted to have this opportunity in this important set of months heading up to the general election to welcome Douglas Alexander, Shadow Secretary of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Chairman of the General Election Strategy as well for the Labour Party, who's going to discuss with us this evening British foreign policy in the coming years and talking about the subtitle of Progressive Internationalism at a Time of Introversion. Chatham House has had the pleasure, both in the lead up to the last general election and now doing the same in this one, to have an opportunity for a discussion and a conversation about the challenges facing Britain at this complex time in international relations, and try and do it maybe a little less in debate style at times and a bit more in a conversational way that will let us dig into the issues, hopefully with a bit more depth and a bit more time than is sometimes allowed for in a general election strategy where foreign policy doesn't tend to be at the top of the agenda. Douglas Alexander, who took up his shadow position in January 2011, is particularly well placed to talk us through his perspectives and the Labour Party's perspectives on the foreign policy challenges facing Britain. He was Secretary of State for International Development in the lead up to 2007, was appointed in that position and held it for 3 years up through the general election. He was Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary of State for Scotland. He previously served as a Minister for Europe and also as a Minister in the Foreign Office for Investment and Foreign Affairs, Trade, Investment and Foreign Affairs. So he's played both the development agenda, the commercial agenda, and the diplomatic agenda in the UK context. So Douglas, we're just delighted you would come and join us for this on-the-record session and discussion. We look forward to your opening thoughts and then to engaging in conversation. So welcome to Chatham House. Look forward to your thoughts.
Robin, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Given the number of people in the room, I think it's probably fair to judge that this is on the record. What could possibly go wrong with a Labour politician wearing a microphone? Memories of past elections come to mind. Can I thank you in all sincerity for those kind words of introduction, and also thank your team here in Chatham House for putting on this evening's event. As you reflected in your introduction, we are now less than 100 days from the next general election. But tonight, in this esteemed setting of Chatham House, newly designated last month, I'm delighted to say, the top global think tank outside the United States, I want to take the opportunity to focus not on the electoral politics of the next few months, but on the foreign policy challenges of the next few years. In truth, as most of us gathered here tonight know firsthand, much UK foreign policy is reactive and always has been. But this is not to say British foreign policy need be without reason or strategy. We may not be able to predict what events will dominate the international agenda in the years to come, but we must do what we can to be best prepared to anticipate and respond to them. It was Bobby Kennedy in another era who rightly said, "The future is not a gift, it is an achievement. Every generation helps make its own future." For our generation, making our own future seems an especially daunting task in these particularly turbulent times. But we must continue to strive, I would argue, for that achievement. So today, this evening, I want to set out to you Labour's approach to foreign policy. I want to make the case that a progressive internationalist agenda is the right way forward at a time of growing introversion amongst the global public. In my remarks this evening, I'd like to cover 4 broad areas. First, let me be so bold as to give my assessment of current global trends, including defining what I mean by introversion amongst the global public. Second, I will set out the values and principles that underlie Labour's approach to foreign policy, including what I mean by progressive internationalism. Thirdly, I'll discuss contemporary examples of how progressive internationalism can be applied to contemporary situations of today. And finally, I'll set out why I believe we should together reject a politics of pessimism and instead ensure the Foreign Office here in the United Kingdom has the tools to advance that politics of progressive internationalism. Now, any incoming government in May will need to advance its international priorities in the face of very real constraints, already much discussed in forums such as this. A recalibration of America's global role, still likely to remain, however, the dominant superpower, but operating under new constraints and challenges. A complex range of threats arising from the long crisis in the wider Middle East, including Syria and Iraq, as well as the Sahel, northern Nigeria, Somalia, and Kenya. These threats include terrorism, organised crime, and growing and already massive flows of refugees. And of course, budgetary constraints, felt across Europe in particular, including the impact there has been on defence and development budgets, as well as traditional and public diplomacy. But I would also argue that these constraints actually reveal broader forces at play. They are being amplified by what I see as 5 key trend lines defining today's foreign policy environment. So let me address each of these 5 trends in turn. First, the return of geopolitical competition among an increasing number of global actors. The global financial crisis has, of course, amplified and accelerated a shift in power away from the West. This has led to a renewed, if not new, struggle for position among different power centers. In Asia, the competition between a rising China has spawned naval disputes with Japan and Southeast Asia and competition over natural resources. Ukraine today is at the epicenter of an emerging fault line between Russia and the West. And in the Middle East, the rise of ISIL is in part fueled by regional powers engaged in a wider and continuing sectarian conflict. Second, the current model of global governance has come under renewed and sustained pressure in recent years. If the last 2 decades have been defined by so-called coming together, many countries are now focusing on the challenges of interdependence as well as its benefits. America is pursuing greater energy independence, China is focused on stimulating domestic consumption, and Germany is reassessing its relationship with its Eurozone neighbours. Thirdly, the rise of what I term economic warfare. Although brutal and bloody wars continue to rage from Damascus to Donbass, another key battlefield has emerged in the economic sphere. Today, sanctions are increasingly being deployed instead of military strikes. Competing trade regimes are mimicking the role of past military alliances. Currency wars are at least as common as occupation of territory, and the manipulation of the price of resources such as oil can in fact be more consequential than conventional arms races. Fourth, a fragmentation of politics and a growing trend towards inequality within states. Brzezinski has described how the world is experiencing a global political awakening that is constraining the ability of the old elites to govern. But although the desire for accountability and transparency is growing, this remarkable change of political activism is not driving the world universally towards liberal democracy. The most dramatic illustration of this is perhaps the Arab uprising. This fragmentation is underpinned by the global trend towards growing inequality within states, even as the rise of China and India is narrowing global income inequality. Much of the dramatic drop in world extreme poverty in recent years, as measured by the World Bank, from around 1/3 to below 15% in 2011, has of course been fueled by Asia's economic growth, not a global shift in natural resources towards the poor. And finally, let me set out one of the most significant trends that is defining the global environment in which foreign policy decisions will be taken in the years ahead. The 5th trend is a growing introversion among the global public. Over the last decades, we've seen a public becoming increasingly skeptical about global involvement, let alone leadership. In the face of TV images of terrorist atrocities ranging from Nigeria to Paris, there is a growing sense that the threats we now face are so complex that somehow they are essentially insurmountable. Claims that Britain and the West more generally is on a course of inevitable decline are then used to justify a politics of retreat and isolationism based on the assumption that nothing we do abroad could anyway make a difference. And here in the United Kingdom, following the 2003 invasion of Iraq and its aftermath, we've also seen a collapse in trust that has permanently raised the bar of public legitimacy for future military interventions whichever government puts them before Parliament. In Chatham House's own fascinating survey published last week, there were positive signs of a shift in public attitudes, especially since 2005. But 60% of those polled still agreed with the following statement: the UK is expected to do too much internationally. The UK should do less and others should do more. But this is not simply a British or even European phenomenon. In the United States, a recent Pew Global Attitudes research survey showed that for the first time since Pew began asking those questions in 1964, more than half of the respondents felt that the United States should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along the best that they can on their own. So if these are the trends that will help shape our global future, what are the tools that we can use to together navigate this changing global terrain? I don't deny that some of the core interests of UK foreign policy are common between parties and across governments, namely defending the economic prospects and physical security of British citizens. Promoting our core interest in a concrete sense means, for example, ensuring we remain at the forefront of cyber capabilities, supporting multilateral disarmament while looking at ways in which a credible minimum deterrent can be used most efficiently, and continuing to invest in our special forces and in our ability to support local and regional security forces. In particular, we will need to continue to devote substantial resources to tackling the threat of terrorism in all of its manifest forms. The work that our security services and intelligence agencies do in this area deserve, of course, our praise and respect, and will continue to be vital to our national interest for years to come. But an incoming Labour government in 2015, led by Ed Miliband, for such a government, this core interest will be pursued within a clear framework of progressive values and principles. We know that we do not have to shape these from scratch. They are the principles on which the post-war European order was based and which the post-war Labour government had a very central role in creating in the first place. It was, of course, a Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who hosted the first ever meeting of the UN General Assembly at Westminster Hall back in 1946, which started the process of decolonisation with independence for India following in 1947, and which was a founder member of NATO by 1949. So let me set out for you those principles on which a progressive foreign policy will be based. First, clearly, the experience of the last century has taught us that strength at home has been a contributor to peace abroad. If we are unable to deliver broad-based prosperity for our people here in the United Kingdom, built on the foundation of an economy that works for all, then the attraction of populism and introversion in our politics will only grow. Second, we've benefited from organised and sustained solidarity between like-minded states, unprecedented in history, based on common democratic values. The willingness of this government to open the question of the UK's continued EU membership, indeed with a Foreign Secretary who seems to support departure, undermines this very basic principle of solidarity. Other disintegrative forces also pose threats. The election of Syriza and potential Grexit, separatism in Spain or indeed in Scotland, and anti-European Le Pen government in France, at least as a possibility. NATO, the EU, the ECHR, the UN, and the Commonwealth, and our close and continuing relationship with the United States are not, in truth, simply groupings of convenience, but deeply rooted communities of fate. These communities need to be defended and nurtured in the years ahead. Thirdly, we must enhance the collective weight and impact of the main post-1945 global institutions and treaties: the United Nations, the IMF, the WTO, the NPT, and their related international norms, respect for human rights, the laws of war and intervening to combat genocide and repression, solidarity with the poor and dispossessed, rejecting forcible border changes, and protecting freedom of navigation on the seas. In particular, that means continuing to champion the creation of the UN Commission on Human Rights and advances in international justice that have already been truly transformative. It means ensuring that our international and regional institutions are recalibrated to better tackle climate change. The UN summit in Paris later this year is our chance to demonstrate how this will work in practice to the benefit of our global community. But it also means demonstrating our commitment to human rights, not just through these global institutions, but by reflecting these norms and principles in the application of our own foreign policy priorities. I believe that these three principles, prioritizing domestic strength, promoting the principle and practice of solidarity, and preserving those global norms, are the basis of a progressive approach to foreign affairs. And progressive internationalism is an actively and consciously engaged approach to promoting and upholding these principles on the international stage. So how would progressive internationalism be implemented in practice? Well, let me offer you a by no means exhaustive, but certainly illustrative series of examples of this approach. First, let me begin with the region which is at the forefront of so many minds today, the Middle East. Richard Haass has suggested that for all the comparisons that have been made to the First World War or indeed to the Cold War, what is taking place in the region today more resembles the 30 Years' War of Europe in the first half of the 17th century. In fact, the case of the Middle East sectarian divisions have been coinciding with state failure on a scale seldom seen since the Second World War. Political fragmentation and military confrontation are driving a region already in turmoil into potential further despair. Now, given the current tendency towards fragmentation, we must accept the unfortunate reality that democratic transformations of other societies are beyond the means of outsiders alone to achieve. In this tumultuous context, it is worth bluntly acknowledging that our first order priority, along with our allies, must be to seek to do no further harm in the region already scarred by foreign involvement of various forms. Clearly, much has been already said about the fundamental error in the rationale for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, ridding Saddam of WMDs. But what has also subsequently emerged is the fact that removing Saddam Hussein and empowering the Shiite majority without ensuring adequate safeguards for the Sunni Arab minority exacerbated sectarian frictions within the country. Iraq became seen as a country supporting Iranian ambitions rather than balancing them, thereby further destabilizing an already volatile regional power balance. British foreign policy, let us be honest, over the past decade has been conducted in the long shadow of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The priority for the next Labour government will be ensuring that in the next decade we conduct foreign policy that learns appropriate lessons. The publication of the Chilcot report must therefore be a turning point. That is why we want to see it published at the earliest practical opportunity. All of us who want Britain to have a progressive internationalist foreign policy have an interest in seeing that report published. Learning the lessons from the Chilcot inquiry will mean for the next Labour government not turning our back on the world, but turning the page in terms of foreign policy. We believe that neither neoconservatism nor neo-isolationism is the right way forward for British foreign policy. So while we must learn the lessons of Iraq, we must not be paralysed by it. That is why there is an urgent need for the inquiry to conclude its work. Today in Iraq, the new government has already taken important steps and we should support it as it continues to do so. But that cannot be a substitute for the failure of local elites to take responsibility for their own future. It would not be right, therefore, for outside powers to have the sole responsibility for liberating Mosul or other cities from ISIL. That is the job, rightly, that has to be led by Iraqis with the support of those people being liberated. And so let us turn to Syria. We must be clear that the choice is not between a 2003-style military intervention on one hand and doing nothing at all on the other hand. I'll be open with you, none of us who cast our votes in Parliament back in August of 2013 could guarantee that they would have given rise to an agreement to remove Assad's chemical weapons under UN supervision. But all of us should be grateful that in fact it did. Today, more than 200,000 have died in Syria and over 2 million have fled. And while the conflict rages, the suffering of the Syrian people continues. Today, there is still some hope that the gap between what Russia and the West want for Syria is not wholly unbridgeable. So faced with military stalemate on the ground, well-armed jihadist opposition forces, and the world's worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, it is right that the United Nations and wider international community are now looking at models of more gradual change than those first anticipated by the failed Geneva I and Geneva II processes. As well as this more recent Syrian conflict, long-standing conflicts continue, of course, across the Middle East. In Israel and Palestine, the passing of time seems only to bring heightened frustration as opposed to calming tensions. Despite the laudable and exhaustive work of John Kerry in 2013, the latest rounds of negotiations collapsed in April last year, and although we will all wait to see what emerges from the coming Israeli elections next month, their resumption of these talks is currently not on the table. Never have prospects looked bleaker in the past decade, so it is right that the United Kingdom and our allies now explore ways to move forward negotiations. Turning then from the Middle East to Russia, it is clear that in recent months, Russia has emerged as a real foreign policy challenge for Britain and its allies. President Putin has calibrated his actions in Ukraine after the fall of the pro-Russian President Yukhanovich on the basis of a seeming unwillingness of others to resort to overt military force. But he appears to have miscalculated the concerted commitment of his adversaries to forceful economic diplomacy. In recent months, we have seen the economic underpinning of his aggressive foreign policy now being steadily undermined by the collapse in state revenues that reduced oil and gas prices is now bringing to Russia. That is why I believe the EU is right to be looking again at the sanctions regime in light of the recent rocket attacks in Mariupol. Ukraine today is at the epicenter of an emerging fault line between Russia and the West. The priority going forward must be to remain on guard against Russia's efforts to find and exploit weaknesses among its European neighbours, especially given President Putin's apparent temptation to prey on European states weakened by recession and vulnerable to subversion, subsidy, and corruption. At the same time, we must also make clear to the Russian government that we continue to recognise our long-term underlying shared interests in cooperation rather than conflict. Because in truth, this crisis is not only about Russia, it is also about Ukraine. Unless its economy and state can be reformed and modernised, stability in that part of the world will remain elusive. It is up to the Ukrainian government to take the lead, making its own independent judgments about the path it wishes to follow. But the EU and the IMF, most importantly, should be prepared to support a credible programme of economic reform in the Ukraine. Support for Ukraine, coupled with a firm and united front towards Russia, is the way to help end the conflict and encourage reconciliation between the West and Russia, who today sit precariously on either side of that global fault line. Although the Middle East, Russian aggression, or even the reach of Brussels may have regularly dominated our headlines here in the United Kingdom, I believe that the rise of Beijing will be fundamental in shaping our long-term futures. Governments in the past have struggled to decide whether to view China through the prism of a competitive global power or an economic adversary or an unstable exemplary of political fragmentation on a massive scale. In fact, the UK's policy towards China and the Asia-Pacific more widely should include a strong focus on economics, exploiting new and dynamic markets, but it needs to be about much more than that. It also needs to focus on how to ensure that China's emergence as a global actor is based on mutual respect, both for other nations, but more importantly, for the rules governing the international order and economy more generally. Until recently, China and India were often bracketed together in UK policy discussions of Asia, defined mainly as markets and economic actors. Today, some increasingly bracket China as a security problem alongside Russia, both as states not playing by the West's rules. I don't believe this as a single lens by which to view China is helpful. China's territorial disputes do pose serious challenges for regional security, but unlike in the Kremlin, many of its leaders seem aware that if they push these too far, the backlash could harm their core interests of stability and economic development. Our hope must be that economic consolidation and domestic political progress will reinforce rather than undermine China's historic caution towards external adventurism, not because there is not a space for a dynamic and successful Asian power, but because that power must be predicated on a respect for the rules of the international system that form the pillars of our collective global order. Finally, let me turn to the issue of Europe and Britain's place within it. Our party, Labour, is clear that membership of the European Union remains central both to our prosperity and our security as a nation. At a time when great power struggles are once again emerging, and when economic warfare has once again become a central tool of foreign policy, it is clear that our membership makes us stronger and helps promote our interests and our values in this changing international scene. And yet one of my greatest concerns as a prospective Foreign Secretary is that too often we are now seen by our European allies not as a leader or a contributor, but as a potential problem and adversary. In opposition, we have laid out a substantive reform agenda for the European Union. I gave a speech in this very room setting out our vision of change in the European Union back in January of 2013. Substantial reform of the EU budget, greater powers for national parliaments, and changes to transitional controls for new member states. I and my shadow cabinet colleagues have already begun building European coalitions for change. And I am clear that Britain needs a post-Cameron Europe policy, so in government, Labour will set itself the task of reviewing, repairing and resetting our country's approach to Europe. That will inevitably include repairing relations with key allies, building relations with key ministries across Europe, as well as training and engaging more British officials based in EU institutions that have seen UK influence and interests undermined for too long. This government has sadly, I would argue, presided over simply the biggest loss of British influence in Europe for a generation, arguably at one of the most crucial times in our membership. And in the uncertain and unpredictable times in which we live, the case for Europe and for Britain's place at its heart is one that I believe needs to be heard loudly and strongly in the months and years ahead. It is vital to ensure that departments right across government are prepared and equipped to adapt to the global trends and contemporary challenges that I've sought to outline this evening. So today I can announce that on coming to office, an incoming Labour government would undertake a wide-ranging review of how Britain projects both its interests and its values internationally. This review, commissioned by and reporting directly to the Prime Minister, would provide the backdrop to the National Security Council's existing work. Importantly, the review would ensure that aspects of foreign policy that don't fit easily into a security framework are given due weight, including, for example, the importance of our relationship with Europe and our strategy for engagement with other multilateral institutions. Within the Foreign Office, a further strategic diplomacy review would also be conducted to review and oversee the workings of the FCO itself and how best it can support that strategy for projecting Britain's values and interests abroad. This work would take place in parallel to the Strategic Defence and Security Review. Now, I hope, even from my brief remarks this evening, it is clear that the entry of a future Foreign Secretary would include many difficult and challenging issues. But I don't believe that the policy challenges can be an excuse for a politics of despair. I am confident that the United Kingdom, along with our closest allies, does have the capabilities and the resources to advance a progressive internationalism in the interests of our citizens. Let me try and tell you why. It is certainly true that the position of Western and especially United States strategic dominance established after 1990 is beginning to come under challenge. But let me also put this to you. The United States will continue to have the world's most formidable military for the foreseeable future. Its economy remains one of the world's largest. Its workers are not aging as quickly as those in Europe, Japan, or China, and no country seems to have the capacity for greater technological innovation. And the United Kingdom continues to have a key role in our global future. We will remain one of the most capable global powers for many years to come, with the world's 5th largest defence budget, the 2nd largest aid budget, and the 4th largest diplomatic network anywhere in the world. The UK today makes up 1% of the global population, but 4.4% of global trade. We're the 5th largest economy in the world, as I said, and represent around 13% of the world's creative industries and 12% of all the world's scientific papers. And our networks stretch across the United Nations Security Council, the European Union, the Commonwealth, NATO, strong alliances with the United States and others, as well as our historic links with key regions and countries from the Gulf and parts of Africa to as far as Australia and New Zealand. So I fundamentally believe that one of our greatest assets, which will be preserved for decades to come, is that we have the skills of the people of the United Kingdom to deliver with us in the years ahead. Think for a moment of the brave soldiers and doctors and the NGO logisticians deployed in Sierra Leone to stem Ebola. Think of our military personnel now operating in support of the Iraqi government, or consider the diplomats around the world who are some of the brightest and best men and women anywhere, and the unparalleled reach and impact of the BBC World Service. I am determined to support them in ensuring that they have the resources needed to serve our national interests and our national values in the coming years. Progressive internationalism is about explicitly doing more to foster these assets and to integrate them as a policy objective with hard power and military assets. So I do understand both the challenges and the constraints that we face as a country. But I also have faith in the people who work to sustain Britain's international engagement and in the principles that should guide us in how we move forward. The terrain is different, but the priorities endure. So let me try and draw in conclusion these threads of the case I've advanced this evening together. The response to these contemporary challenges, the return of geopolitical competition, the rise of economic warfare, the pressures on global governance, the introversion that accompanies the fragmentation of politics, are frankly too often framed through a prism of decline and a tendency towards political pessimism. It is true that these trends mean that the UK will continue to face real challenges in the years ahead in the international sphere. But those who counsel inevitable decline are driven by a politics of pessimism, not simply realpolitik, as they all too often claim. But the role of leaders, I would argue, is to now persuade a war-weary society that an active and engaged British foreign policy is the best way to promote and protect our values and our interests. Today there is a long way to go, and we and our allies have been caught wrong-footed in the past. But we must continue to make that case that our institutions and alliances do provide a strength that our challengers cannot match if we stay united. Selling this case, frankly, will be difficult, but it is fundamental and, I argue, absolutely essential, because political consent is a more important aspect of international affairs than ever in the past. So as progressives at a time of growing introversion, we have a unique responsibility to reject those who try to promote a Little Britain, or in some cases Little England approach that suggests we should simply turn our back on the world and try to draw up the drawbridge. Our shared task for government is to build consent for an outward-looking Britain, which I believe is still the best way to advance not just our interests, but also our values. That is why, in this time of increasing introversion, I see it as Labour's task, as my task, and as the next government's task to continue to make the case for Britain to advance a foreign policy of progressive internationalism in the years and decades ahead. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Shadow Secretary. That's a very comprehensive take on the way you see the world changing, the choices for Britain, and as you said at the end, the case you're making for progressive internationalism. And I think your comments at the beginning are laid out for all of our members here and those watching on the live stream, which I should add as well. Welcome to members who are not in the room. The return of geopolitical competition, economic warfare, fragmentation of politics, and you said this growing introversion, and the need to operate on three principles, as I heard it. Strength at home, which would give the opportunity for peace and engagement abroad, solidarity with like-minded states, and you drew the EU in particular as a key example of those like-minded states, and the ability to uphold institutions that reflect the kind of values that the country reflects, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, WTO, Geneva, Human Rights Council, etc. And then you gave a whole set of examples of how that would play out. If I could make just one quick question on this. I mean, you spent quite a bit of time on the Middle East, and I'm sure we'll come back to it when we come to comments and questions from our guests and members here. But you said our main priority in the Middle East needs to be not to do more harm. And that was a key phrase in there. I think it was a key priority. But what if not doing more harm means potentially weakening the values on which progressive internationalism is based? No harm may mean human rights getting worse. No harm may mean the Non-Proliferation Treaty perhaps being undermined further as other countries decide they have to seek their own forms of protection. Rules of law, Geneva being flouted by different actors in the region. It is a very difficult balance to strike between, in essence, thinking, you know what, we cannot fix the Middle East, and I think you've said as much, to then say, well, we might as well contain the problem. We know there are threats coming, but we almost need to draw a cordon sanitaire around the Middle East. Do you think it's possible to strike that idea of not over-engaging, avoiding doing more harm, and yet at the same time preserving values?
I don't see the phrase avoiding doing harm as an invitation to passivity. Okay. In the sense that I think that, with the greatest respect, that was somewhat to over-interpret that phrase as implying somehow one is capable of imposing some kind of cordon sanitaire around the region. But I think, on the other hand, it's a principle I would stand by, that we have to judge very carefully our engagement with that region, as I say, not being paralyzed by the past, but learning lessons from it. I think one of the challenges that we face is looking at the most obvious examples, on one hand Iraq and on the other hand Syria, one where there was Western military intervention, and we've seen a decade of sectarian conflict after 2003. On the other hand, in the absence of Western military intervention, you've seen horrendous sectarian conflict within Syria. So for me, it is not as binary as all too many columnists and commentators suggest, that somehow intervention in any circumstance is indefensible or always justifiable. There needs to be very finely calibrated and vital judgments exercised. But the foundation for that judgment has to be an honest assessment of efficacy as well as intent. Will the action being taken yield the result that you intend it to take? And that has to be part of that judgment in relation to doing no harm.
Do you think that in the international community is striking the right balance then right now in Syria?
I don't think anybody can feel any pride in what's the worst humanitarian catastrophe, but it's ultimately, of the 21st century, but it is ultimately a failure of politics. Now, in that sense, it has manifested, well, at every level. First of all, the establishment of an inclusive government within Syria. Secondly, a failure of politics at a regional level, where we've seen a regional conflict played out by proxy. I've long argued, for example, that if we're not able to get the active participants to this conflict around a table, then there was a case for a contact group, looking at how we could actually use, on one hand, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Iranians and others in the same room to see if there is at least the basis for talks about talks. So in that sense, there's been a manifest failure of politics within the country. There has been a failure of politics within the region. And if we are honest, there's been a manifest failure of politics at a global level as well. So in that sense, no, I don't cite Syria as an example of where things have gone anything other than wrong. But in that sense, the challenge is, what action can yield the result that we're looking for in relation to Syria? Does anybody honestly in this room believe if there was 150,000 Western troops in Syria today, that would itself resolve the sectarian character of the conflict that we're describing? I don't see many in the international community putting up their hands. And in that sense, part of the challenge is saying, what instruments do we have at our disposal? I met the Russian ambassador in London last week and talked to him at that time in relation to what was happening in relation to Moscow. He was suitably cautious in suggesting that it was simply a means by which, at least to begin a process by which people could get to know each other and to talk. Frankly, given the failure of Geneva I and Geneva II, I welcome the welcome that John Kerry has shown for that initiative. But the urgency of the situation demands that in the meantime, there is a huge focus on humanitarian efforts to alleviate the suffering. And I also personally feel more should be done to try and stabilise neighbouring countries. We've got a long and historic relationship, for example, with Jordan. Now, quite a lot of money is going into UN camps in Jordan at the moment, but I think we need to be looking actively at what further support can be given to areas of relative stability, Jordan being one of the ones at the top of the list.
And just a quick question, you said progressive internationalism is about doing more. The one feature of whoever wins the next election, the one feature that they're going to discover as they come in is there'll be less money, rather more money. And with the protected areas of government spending that seem to exist at the moment, even the minimal amount that's put into the Foreign Office in relative terms now, and I suppose you said we're I think the fourth largest defence spender right now, but these numbers are going to potentially drop. How does one do more with less?
I think that's probably one of the principal arguments for engagement with Europe. The European Union is a profoundly powerful force multiplier for the interests and values of the United Kingdom on the international stage. But the advertent or inadvertent withdrawal from influence within the European Union under the present government, I don't mean that in a cheap partisan way, I just think it's an observable fact, I think is a classic example of where for no further financial contribution we could have much more significant impact on the international stage. That's why I mentioned, that British officials serving in the Commission, the European Council, it's a form of it's a dereliction of our international duty to be willfully withdrawing influence from institutions that continue to affect the interests of the United Kingdom. And if you're a young, ambitious civil servant in the Foreign Office under this government, you don't think going to Brussels is going to enhance your career. We need to reverse that view that says there's a clear path for people to continue to advance their careers within the diplomatic service while making an active contribution to the institutions of the European Union. So that would be one example. There are more, but I think it's a good example of where, for no significant financial outlay, we could, if you like, secure more bang for our buck.
Well, I'm going to get some questions from our members and guests here in a second. Lots of hands have gone up, and I've seen quite a few from the beginning. Just while I'm catching eyes, one question came in from a member very efficiently over Twitter just before we started. So let me just put this one in because it ties it precisely into your point. The question for Mike Bryan, a Chatham House member, is that there is no process at the moment that allows the UK Parliament to reform or repeal EU laws. This question about the democratic legitimacy of EU institutions, if we're going to think about the EU as a multiplier for the UK, will it have the democratic legitimacy to be able to play that role if ultimately there's a sense of a loss of trust or a loss of confidence amongst a large proportion of the British public in the democratic accountability that it faces vis-a-vis the national parliament? What would you say to that issue?
I would say with humility, the European Union is not the only institution facing those challenges in relation to public legitimacy right now. It's afflicting politics more generally. In terms of what can we do, I actually, from this stage more than 18 months ago, ahead of the government, recommended the use of the red card system by national parliaments to give a greater say to national parliaments within the legislative process of the European Union. I was delighted, if imitation is the greatest form of flattery, that the government then themselves championed this red card system. But frankly, that's but one step in a longer journey. I think a lot of hope and faith was invested in the European Parliament as an institution capable of closing the legitimacy gap. And with the greatest respect to my colleagues in the European Parliament, I think that is not itself the only solution to this challenge. We need to look at how the Commission operates, we need to look at how national parliaments operate, at the same time as looking at how the Parliament works. Okay,
let me get I may need to take a couple of questions at a time. I'll see how it's going in terms of the hands. I've seen a lot go up already, so I may not be able to get to everyone. First, the gentleman there, and the lady here at the front. I'll take two at a time, if that's right. Sure. I can see we've got 15 minutes, so we might just give us a chance, and then I'll come here.
Dominic Brett from the European Parliament.
Hi, Dominic.
I really didn't know that.
It's those silky diplomatic skills that mark me out as a prospective Foreign Secretary. I'm sorry.
We work for the Information Office here, and we're strictly non-partisan. What would a Labour government say to Syriza and Podemos and populist and popular movements of the left.
Okay, Syriza and populism. And your question is on Europe. I think this question is likely to be on Europe, so I'm going to... question here? Yeah, right here. If you pass the microphone down, that gentleman right there. I've got these two here coming up afterwards.
Ronald Harrison, Chatham House. Given the illegal Israeli policies towards Palestine, would a Labour government consider recognizing the state of Palestine?
Let's start with those two easy ones, yeah?
Okay. You see, if you do 3 questions, you tend to avoid the difficult one. But
Yeah,
given I've been
no,
asked 2 and they're both difficult.
No, my job is to make sure you can't
In
avoid
terms
them,
of
right?
Syriza and Podemos, listen, as the Labour Party, we're in a fundamentally different place from populist parties, in that I believe our route to electoral success, but much more significantly to effective governance, lies in a politics of answers, not of anger. And in that sense, it's for other political parties to frame their approach and to offer the policies that they so choose. But I would counsel against those within the Labour Party and those commenting on the Labour Party who suggest that somehow as a party that aspires to government, your sole task is to amplify anger. I think that given the collapse in trust we've seen across Europe post the financial crisis, the collapse in trust in the powerful, not just in bankers and regulators, but in politicians as well, there is a real premium on striking the right balance as a political party between radicalism and credibility. Because if, as a political party, all you offer is credibility in today's political climate of distrust, people won't vote for you in sufficient numbers because they'll think nothing's going to change. If, on the other hand, all you offer is radicalism, then I don't believe that that meets the threshold that people in the United Kingdom expect from a prospective party of government. So it is an elusive but vital equilibrium that you're constantly trying to strike of radicalism, the prospect that things can change and will be better, but credibility, your capacity to effectively govern the country. Now, it's for other parties to make their judgments. I would simply observe it's a challenge that's not unique here in the United Kingdom. If you look at across every member of the European Union, at the share of the vote that has been secured by the main centre-left party combined with the main centre-right party, pre-2007, the collective vote was 70%. Since 2007, it's averaged 55%. So there has been a 15% decline in the main centre-left and centre-right's combined vote share, and that's across every European country. So in that sense, what we're seeing with Podemos or what we're seeing with Syriza is evidence of broader trends of people moving towards a politics defined by identity and a politics defined by insecurity. And that's certainly a challenge that confronts the Labour Party along with every other party. In relation to the issue of Palestinian recognition, well, again, when this matter came to the United Nations, we took a different approach from the present government in saying that we would have used our vote and our voice to support enhanced recognition for the Palestinians at the United Nations. Since then, there has been a vote on the principle of recognition, consistent with that position that we took, which we voted on last year. And again, we were in a position where we voted and affirmed our commitment to the principle of reconciliation. But there was an amendment to that motion that came before the Westminster Parliament that said, if I recollect, in the service of or as a contribution towards a negotiated two-state solution. And I was very clear in terms of the front bench statements that were made at the time that we reserve the issue of the timing and circumstances in which to give expression to that principle in a way that we think most constructively contributes to that negotiated two-state solution. Now, as I say, at the moment, we are in the terrible position where there is neither peace nor a process. As in, when people say, oh, you can't talk about recognition because it will prejudice the negotiations, well, right now there aren't negotiations. And in that sense, the most urgent task is to find a way forward after the Israeli elections, given the exhaustive efforts that I spoke of John Kerry. But in principle, we've been clear for a couple of years that statehood is not a gift to be given to the Palestinians, but a right to be recognised. And in that sense, that endures and will endure in government.
Okay, 2 questions here at the front, please. Lots of hands going up. I've got these 2 here first.
Farah Hussain, Labour councillor. So you spoke of Britain's alliances being built on shared values, and you gave the example of a belief in democracy. So how do you account for Britain's alliance with Saudi Arabia, and is this likely to change under a Labour government?
So Saudi Arabia, and a question coming up here.
Thank you very much. Yosumi from the Japanese Embassy. First, very briefly, thank you for the British people and the people all over the world about support for the solidarity for Japan in terms of the hostility crisis for the last 2 weeks. Thank you very much for that. My question is about like-mindedness, and we appreciate your remarks about the upholding norms and rule of law. For a country far from the UK, we not to see that the UK will remain as a key player in the world. But how are you going to deal with the question of the East of Suez, or even the contribution to the Asia-Pacific security environment? Thank you.
So one question there, as you saw, about Saudi and values, etc., and the other about the role a country like Britain can play east of Suez at a particular, you mentioned the geopolitical competition.
Sure. Firstly, in relation to the situation and the relationship with Saudi Arabia, at Foreign Office Questions just a couple of weeks ago, I raised this issue with the Foreign Secretary in relation to the blogger, and he'd been flogged once at that point, and I was asking the question as to what actions he had taken personally. Had he raised this with the Saudi Foreign Minister? Had he made representations? And at that point, I got an undertaking from Philip Hammond that it would be raised at the meeting which the Saudi Minister was attending the following Thursday here in London in relation to the group of countries working together to confront ISIL. I've also subsequently written to the Saudi ambassador on that specific case. So in that sense, I am not naive that there is a continuing level of cooperation on security matters with Saudi Arabia, but as that evidence or example from just the last 10 days, I hope bears testimony, that needn't be at the cost of raising issues where we diverge fundamentally from the Saudi authorities. I sought in my remarks to reflect the truth that it is not within our gift to prescribe the rate at which countries within the Middle East or elsewhere embrace the democratic values that we hold dear. But that's not an excuse not to continue to advocate for them, or particularly in relation to human rights, to make clear where we feel that there is a divergence between what we regard as being international norms and their individual conduct. In relation to our gentleman from Japan, of course, I'm sure with everybody else in the room we extend our sympathies, as you describe. In relation to east of Suez, there are particular challenges that are emerging in that region of the world. I think there's a compelling case that quite a lot of the 21st century's history is going to be written in that particular area. In that sense, I paid a visit last year to Australia as a guest of the Australian government and came back both impressed by Australia's engagement with Asia. I think there are many lessons that we can learn from where, with relatively constrained resources, Australia has worked very effectively to extend its influence and to make itself relevant to some of the decisions that are being taken. But we also saw in relation to, for example, the operation of OCMIN, a continuing presence and engagement. Now, as one of the five powers, we've got a continued interest in terms of East Asia as well. So, again, my sense is Asia is an issue which, if you pressed either of the most recent foreign secretaries, the present one or the last one, at a theoretical level, they would accept is very important. They would accept that in terms of the trend lines, it's going to become more important, not less. But my private fear is it never quite reaches the top of their in tray. And I suppose in terms of what I've described this evening, I hope I've communicated at least an awareness of not always allowing the urgent to crowd out the important. Our engagement with Asia and the Far East is going to be important for Britain in the decades ahead.
Okay, I've got two questions waiting here. First there, and then front. Wait 1 second, there's a gentleman behind you first.
Thank you, Stephen Wright, retired diplomat. Thank you very much for that statement, Mr. Alexander. I think it gives encouragement to all those who care about Britain's role in the world. A question about the instruments of global governance, IMF, UN Security Council, World Bank. They're all really crying out for reform to bring in the new powers from the emerging economies and markets. much as the G8 has given way to the G20. But how can you approach this, given that almost any reform is going to reduce Britain's influence? How can we square that circle?
And if you just pass the microphone in front of you, Steve. Okay.
Sam Nassif, I'm a member of the Institute and a journalist. Jack Straw made an intervention. He went and visited Iran, and it was a kind of kicker effect for relations with Iran from the Western world. Do you conceive a similar situation if you take over, leadership of this country, somebody making a similar gesture towards Syria and maybe leading to some better solution of the problem? You said you were against troops, and so you are against military intervention. 150,000 troops wouldn't solve it. But what about political intervention, like Jack Straw?
Do you want to take those two? And I've got three more where you. I've got about 7 questions, but I've got 3 I'm going to squeeze in after this, and we're coming close to time, so I'll let you use your time.
Okay, let me deal with them in the order in which, Stephen, first of all, thank you for your kind words. I suppose I would draw 2 examples that come to mind. One is my own experience when I was the British Governor of the World Bank, when we worked assiduously over a sustained period to secure an additional seat for Sub-Saharan Africa on the Board of Deputies in the bank. If anything, if I'm honest, the role that we played in that process, which was a leading role, I think enhanced our relevance within the institution rather than diminished it, both because it was transparently an institution that needed to find a way to rebalance, but the navigating the politics of trying to secure that additional Sub-Saharan seat was demanding, and many people had tried and failed before, and we made some progress. So in that sense, I think that makes my broader point. I mean, let's be candid. I think the present government thought that we, as the last Labour government, would call a multilateral summit for the opening of an envelope. And they basically thought, let's put all of our eggs in the bilateral basket, and actually, we'll leave this multilateral stuff to others. And one of my genuine disappointments, looking back over the last 4.5 years, has been how invisible has been a serious agenda for not just multilateral reform, but engagement with the multilateral institutions. If you say, what's Britain's view of NATO? What's Britain's view of the G7 or of the G20? It's a blank sheet of paper right now. And in that sense, that's because I think there was a judgment made at ministerial level that somehow it wasn't core to Britain's interests.
The UK presidency of the G8, I think this government would argue, is one of their highlights, the open transparency agenda that was put forward in terms of taxation, procurement. I mean, the G8, yeah. You think the UK's presidency of the G8
they've not withdrawn from the institution, but if you contrast, for example, what was achieved in the presidency of the G8 under this government with the G20 under the last government, that didn't happen by chance. I travelled with the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown when he went to visit President Lula in Brazil, when he travelled on to Chile, when he literally crossed the globe ahead of the summit to make the summit a success. So I'm not suggesting we don't have a seat at the table. I'm saying how much effort, how many miles have been put in by foreign secretaries, by chancellors, by prime ministers ahead of those meetings to mean that we have more than just a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, that's also one of the lessons I draw in relation to reform. That with the greatest respect to all the former diplomats in the room, if you leave it to the professional negotiators, there will always be endless issues to continue to negotiate. And where there have been moments of genuine reform in the past, it's required the transparent political support, at times political muscle, of ministers and indeed of prime ministers behind it. So in that sense, I think there are practical ways from my own experience at the World Bank you can make progress. But the fundamental lesson I draw is you've got to believe it's one of your priorities as a government, and you've then got to be willing to make the phone calls, get on the planes, do the work to try and yield the political dividends of the reform that you want to see. In relation to Syria, let me say a word about Iran first. I think one of our most pressing challenges is to get the British Embassy in Tehran reopened. And while, of course, there are legitimate security concerns which have to be part of that judgment, My concern is at the moment that there's a rather unseemly spat between the Home Office and the Foreign Office that is delaying us having a functioning, effective embassy once again within Tehran. And at such a critical moment, not just looking ahead to the March deadline and then the July deadline in relation to the nuclear dossier, but more broadly, given the tumult we're witnessing within the Middle East, I think there is an urgency, consistent with our security obligations, to make sure that we get that embassy reopened. That would be a practical step that I think we could and should take. In relation to political intervention in Syria, well, one of the reasons I was meeting the Russian ambassador was to hear directly from him in terms of what he judged the prospects for progress. I have to say, I think, again, it's a good example of where working collaboratively with others in the international community, you're more likely to make the kind of progress that you want to see. I mean, Jack is remembered in terms of his efforts in relation to Tehran, but he should also be remembered as one of the initiators of the E3+3, working effectively with other European foreign ministers and other international partners to get progress in relation to the Iranian nuclear dossier. That seems to me more of a model when you look to somewhere like Syria, countries coming together to judge who is best able to make the kind of progress with the regional powers that we want to see, than the conceit that suggests it's uniquely Britain's responsibility.
We've gone a bit over time. People could just be patient because I've had a lot of hands go up and I've not been able to take them all, and I apologize for that. If I can get people just to ask the three who are left on my list, and I apologize to those at the back and others who wanted to come in, but I've taken the hands as I saw them first. Just one-line question, please, and you can be as telegraphic as you want in your answer, and we'll go a bit over time. There's a lady who's been waiting very patiently here. Yes, you, madam. And I'm going to that corner there, and to this gentleman here. Yeah.
Surely the UK could have considerable influence in the world if it became a candid friend of the USA and not its poodle. This could be a lesson from Iraq. It could criticize and pressure it to change its policy on Israel, and it could have criticized it for its machinations in Ukraine, which of course made Russia fearful of NATO encirclement.
Okay, right, so US, we haven't talked much about the US. Gentleman here, right there, and then I'm going to the back in the corner there to one Chatham House person who's waiting patiently.
William James. You mentioned NATO and blank paper in terms of reform. I was wondering if that applied to defence spending as well. Will Labour keep with the 2% target in the next Parliament?
Okay, question far corner, Tom. Yeah, at least you did have your hand up, so yeah, yes. Actually, that's a Chatham House colleague, and
the gentleman there just asked exactly the same question that I was going to ask, which is about commitment to 2% defence spending. But I would just refer, as you did earlier, to the Chatham House report that came out this week, which is on public attitudes to foreign policy. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about the extent to which you think you can lead foreign policy attitudes in the country, particularly on the issue of Europe, where there's such deep Euroscepticism, whether you think a form of positive engagement in the way that you've described would be able to lead to a more positive view of Europe amongst the British public.
And all those one-line answers, which is going to be very easy for you, but good luck on that. We didn't get any discussion about DFID, and I was just wondering, that DFID FCO connection is something this government has worked hard to try to leverage money. And if you've got a line on that, just whether you'd want to sustain that type of cooperation. We had a question from one of our members outside on this, Billy Hill, on that question.
Okay. On DFID FCO, I mean, of course, as a former Secretary of State for International Development, you would expect me to say this, and I happen to believe it. It needs to have a relentless poverty reduction focus. And in that sense, one of the reasons we came to be recognised as a global leader in development was because of the integrity with which we spent our development budget. And in that sense, that's important and enduring. But on the other hand, I think it's fair to recognise that one of the innovations of the National Security Council, built on what we established a predecessor called NSID, National Security International Development, whereby around the table on a weekly basis beyond the cabinet meeting, you have the Secretary of State for Defence, the Secretary of State for International Development and the Foreign Secretary meeting. My sense is, and I sought to reflect this in my remarks, that NSC has been broadly a positive innovation, partly allowing cross-departmental working. Now, the story I always tell on DFID very quickly is when people say, oh, DFID never worked with the Foreign Office or with the Ministry of Defence. When I was the DFID Secretary of State, my colleague, the Defence Secretary, was Des Brown, and my colleague, the Foreign Secretary, was David Miliband. When I got married back in 2000, there were thankfully a vanishingly small number of politicians at my wedding, but 2 of them were Des Brown and David Miliband. There isn't a structural substitute for good working relationships between ministers. And in that sense, I think while we should look at the NSC and those structures, what you need is goodwill. And my sense is certainly in the early part of this Parliament, Andrew Mitchell and William Hague had a very good working relationship, and I would be keen to establish effective working relationships with Mary or the Defence Secretary in due course. In relation to defence spending, you will be unsurprised if I don't, on behalf of Vernon, commit to his bid in the spending review, which will follow any government, Conservative or Labour, after the election. But I would ask you to look at our record, where when we were in office, we took very seriously our responsibilities, both to upgrade and to strengthen our defences. Indeed, if I recollect, we increased expenditure in real terms when we were in office in the past Labour government. We're in different circumstances, financial resources are constrained, but we take very seriously our responsibility to uphold the security of the people of the United Kingdom. In relation to being a candid friend of the United States, I have no hesitancy in doing that. If you look, for example, at that position that we took in relation to Palestinian recognition at the United Nations, I had some fairly forthright advice from the American ambassador in London ahead of Labour taking that position. But we held to that position, and I think it was the right position. We take a fundamentally different view on something like the International Criminal Court. You know, we continue to believe that Guantanamo should be closed down. There are areas where we take a different view from the American administration, but the kind of easy, familiar anti-Americanism is not my approach to international affairs, and it never has been. If you look at the big challenges that we face, whether in relation to the economy, in relation to security, you know, it benefits and continues to benefit the United Kingdom to be able to have effective working relationships with our allies and partners like the United States.
Dr. Alexander, we've gone over time, but I think you can see by the fact that everyone stayed, despite the fact how cold it is outside. Maybe that's the reason. But everyone stayed. It's warm in here, relatively. Because I think you've just covered a huge and broad waterfront, which reminds us that in this era, time of introversion you described, and not just, I think, with the Chatham House audience, there is huge interest in the impact a country like the UK, maybe a mid-sized power like the UK, can still hold given its avenues for leverage and its networks and connections and experience. So I can see for whoever wins the next election, having this balance between aspiration and means is going to be hugely complex. And this is the bit I think we're all going to have to think very creatively about. Each party will have its particular ideas. Thank you very much for joining us, for asking some very good questions. I apologize to those who I was not able to get to, and there were many. But I think we got a very good feel for your party's outlook on international affairs. Thank you very much indeed. And a strong hand for Douglas Alexander. Thank you. Thank you.